Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Day's Kent Seminar Lecture. Today, we are very happy to have Ms. Elizabeth Irvin as our speaker. Irvin is Deputy Director at Illinois Department of Transportation's Office of Planning and Programming. She focuses on implementation of sustainability initiatives such as National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure and Carbon Reduction Strategy, which are programs funded by the recent Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Prior to IDOT, she worked in the public and nonprofit sectors um, uh, on implementation of clean transportation. She has a bachelor's in music and English and a master's in city planning from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Elizabeth.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm happy to be invited and looking forward to talking to you all today. I will try to, I have some slides, but I will try to keep my presentation brief so we can get into question and answers. And again, let me know if you can't hear me or if there's any other technical difficulties here. Let me make sure let me get my slides up here. So I wanted to start kind of zoomed out a bit from EVs with the question of why does IDOT, a transportation agency, care about electric vehicles? We build roads and bridges. So what's the importance here for a state transportation agency? And so I wanted to show you these pictures. These are almost all these pictures were taken in Illinois, and they really get at the impact that climate change is currently having on our transportation system and the way that it will continue to have an impact on our transportation system going forward. So things that affect our transportation system include flooding and high water, and you can see there's a truck there that went off into a ditch into high water. So it's not just the movement of people, it's also the movement of goods and the impact on the economy. Things like our rail system, impacts to our rail system from extreme heat, and to our road system in the forms of buckling. And then really close to all of our hearts is the impact on our frontline workers who are out there doing construction in the hottest part of the year. So climate change has really visceral effects on the transportation system. And when you look at what's contributing to climate change, transportation is a big piece of that story, and not just historically, but continuing to kind of go in the wrong direction compared to other parts of our economy that have made more rapid progress to decarbonize. So that is at least a piece of the story of why EVs are an important part of our transportation system, an important thing for the department to be focusing on as part of sustainable initiatives. Just to give a little bit of context here, this may be familiar for folks of you who are really in the thick of EVs in the state, but earlier this year we passed the 100,000 electric vehicles registered on the roads here in Illinois. We've seen the number of EVs on the road really increasing pretty rapidly. However, we have a goal in the state of getting to 1 million EVs on the road by 2030. And that was codified in legislation. It's a really important goal of this administration, the governor's office. So getting from where we are today to 2030, which is not that far away and gets shorter every day, we need to make a pretty dramatic increase in the number of EVs in the state. And you can see we're really tracking pretty close to the progress we need to make in order to meet that goal. But as we go over time, we're going to need to see even more and more EVs on the road to meet that goal. So how do we get there? There are a number of pieces of this effort that are being worked on by a wide range of state agencies. And I'm going to focus mostly on EV charging infrastructure because that's where IDOT has its biggest role. But I wanted to kind of, again, zoom out a bit and look at the big picture for a minute. So supporting and getting to that 1 million EVs on the road goal includes supporting EV manufacturing in the state and making sure that not only are they being driven here, but they're being made here and benefiting the Illinois economy. Supporting consumer EV purchasing, electrifying the state fleet, so all of the vehicles that are out and about doing state business, electrifying transit and freight, so not just passenger vehicles, but working vehicles, updating the electric grid to make sure that it's ready for that additional demand, and building out a statewide public charging network. So those are the pieces that we're all working on. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on each of these before spending most of the rest of my time talking about the public charging network and the work that IDOT is doing on that piece in particular. So there's a wide range of agencies that are working on all of these and coordinating very closely. The Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Transportation, the Commerce Commission, Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, Central Management Services, and they do a lot of the state fleet procurements for the state. The Finance Authority, which functions as a green bank or climate bank, the Power Agency, Department of Natural Resources. We are all working together. It's a lot of people and a lot of organizations that have a lot of different purposes. And you can see that EVs touch on all of these different agencies. So just to talk through a little bit of hit on a couple of these programs. One, the Illinois EV rebate program. So this is a program that's managed by the Illinois EPA, and it provides rebates for purchases of all electric vehicles and motorcycles. The last round was end of last year. I believe, I don't know what the plans are for the next round of this, but the information can be found on the state's website at ev.illinois.gov in terms of additional funding for those rebates. Manufacturing incentives. So making sure that we are a competitive state and we're getting those, companies expanding in or relocating in Illinois for companies that manufacture EVs, parts of the supply chain, and beyond EVs, renewables, and energy storage, and bring jobs to the state for students like yourselves, for those of you who are students. So the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity has been doing a lot of work on both the business attraction and also workforce development pieces of this. Trucks and buses, all the working vehicles, there's a lot going on in this space as well. There is state funding through IEPA, several rounds of funding for electric school buses, electric transit buses, and for passenger locomotives, and for local freight. So some of the things that are buses and things that are moving goods around, trucks that are moving things around in communities and really having big air quality impacts. We're also doing everything we can as a state to be competitive for federal grant programs. One of the sort of goals we have is to make sure that Illinois gets at least our fair share of the federal funding in these discretionary grant programs. So things like the low and no emission program, which provides funding for transit electrification. We received a grant for paratransit electrification, and the state IDOT helps local and rural transit agencies purchase those buses and transit vehicles. We also work with some of our bigger transit agencies in the state who have secured their own low-no emission grants. We have applications in from the state to things like the Clean Ports Program and the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program, both of which fund both vehicles and charging and fueling infrastructure for medium and heavy duty applications of electrification. And given Illinois' role in the nation as a real hub for freight, this is a key place where we think that we can be a leader. US EPA also has the Carbon Pollution Reduction Grant Program, And that's a program that the state successfully won a grant to, in part, work on freight electrification. So these are some new and also still pending awards. So this is an area that's going to get very busy very soon. And then, so let's then focus on the charging infrastructure piece of this. And why is the charging infrastructure such a key piece of this strategy to get to 1 million vehicles on the road? When you talk to people who currently own EVs, and is there anybody in the room who owns an EV? I can kind of see you on the screen. Any hands up? Oh, I see one in the audience. Yeah, a couple. So those of you who own an EV know that most of the charging people do is at home. It's the most convenient thing, plugging in overnight. It's the most affordable way to charge an EV. And so really a lot of the charging that's happening now is charging at home, charging at workplaces. But when you talk to people who are kind of curious about an EV and think they might own one someday, what you hear over and over again is that people are really concerned about the availability of public EV charging. What about those times when I am doing a longer distance trip and I run out of fuel? Or what if I live in an apartment building and I can't count on having a charger at my house, or I park on the street? So that is a key piece of getting over this hump in terms of turning people who are potentially interested into sort of willing to make that leap into an EV. And here's a graph that shows the increase in the number of EV charging ports in the state over the last decade plus. And you can see there's a ramp up here, and folks may be familiar with this distinction, but just to make sure we're all kind of talking the same language, we've got level 2 ports on here and DC fast ports, DCFC. So DCFC charging, that's the fastest kind of charging. So that is charging that, depending on the power level, can charge a vehicle in times that are coming closer to what it's like to pull into a gas station. So sort of in the 20-30 minutes from empty. So that's a real focus for the department, and in particular our role, which is focused on that long distance travel on our interstates. People don't want to necessarily be parked for 2 to 4 hours. They want to be able to, stop and grab a bite to eat, or stretch their legs and get back on the road. So that DCFC port number is what we're really working on as a department. So where's the funding coming from for our work? It's coming from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, or sometimes called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, BIL. There's a program called the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or NEVI. And I know I've just thrown out 3 acronyms in the course of 2 sentences, so I apologize. I will try to keep my acronyms to a minimum going forward. But this is a formula program, so this is funding that comes to each of the states based on a number of factors. Illinois is receiving between $148 and $149 million over 5 years from this formula program. There's also a separate program called the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program. That's, again, more of that discretionary grant program that we have to compete with other states to receive. So just before I spend sort of the bulk of the rest of my time talking about NEVI in particular, I wanted to just highlight that it's not the only charging program going on in the state. The Illinois EPA is also running several programs that fund EV charging infrastructure. One is through the Volkswagen settlement funding. That's a little over $12 million for public light-duty EV charging. They also have a program through CEJA, which is the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. This is state funding, and a total of $70 million available for public light-duty charging as well. There have been several rounds of both of those programs so far. For the latest information on those programs, there's a link on this slide. And if you also just search for driving a cleaner Illinois, you'll get to the IEPA's website where they have the most recent details of what things are eligible, what rounds of funding are open, and all of that information. So, NEVI. This is kind of a unique program in that it's really designed to jumpstart private sector investment in fast charging infrastructure. One of the first questions I get asked when I'm talking to people about EV charging and the department's role in it, the first question people ask is, well, why aren't we putting these at interstates or at the interstate rest areas all around the state? It's land that the department already owns. Why don't we just put a charger there? As with most things, there's a kind of complicated story behind why that is not. It's actually illegal. So there's an Eisenhower era federal law that requires that we can't put anything that we charge a fee for at those highway rest areas other than those vending machines that you've seen if you visited one. So we could put a charger there, but we couldn't charge anyone a fee to use it, which, given the expense of this fast charging network, is just not economically viable. So this is charging infrastructure that at the end of the day is not going to be owned by the department. This is infrastructure that is going to be in the places where people want to stop and charge. So at existing gas stations, at grocery stores and hotels, and all those kinds of places. So this is designed to help jumpstart that private sector investment and fill in the gaps where the private sector may be hesitant to start putting in charging infrastructure because of that chicken and egg problem of, are there enough vehicles to support the infrastructure? Without the infrastructure, the vehicles aren't on the road. So the NEVI program has a wide range of specific requirements related to the charger types, where they're located. I can get into more detail on that if folks have questions, but the high level things to know is that we're required to build out our alternative fuel corridors, which are called the AFCs. And what fully built out means is one charger every 50 miles, no more than 1 mile from an exit of those corridors. And that's all across the state. And each of the stations need to have 4 ports at minimum. So they can charge 4 vehicles at the same time. Each port needs to be able to pull 150 kWs. So total, the site, all 4 ports need to be able to pull 150 kWs simultaneously. So we're talking about a pretty significant power demand and some pretty fast charging infrastructure. So the first phase of NEVI is meeting those first requirements. Like I said, building out that every 50 miles, no more than 1 mile off those designated corridors. IDOT did some analysis. You'll see the map on the screen. The roads you see here are in green and yellow. Those are the designated alternative fuel corridors. Those are the state's interstates. And they don't worry too much about the colors. It's basically just when the road was nominated to be part of this AFC program. And the state identified there were 4 existing stations that met the power requirements and the number of port requirements. And we needed an additional 46 locations to build out that network of every 50 miles along those corridors. Once we've finished that phase of every 50 miles, building out those starred locations, we can expand off the corridors. And we've identified a number of priorities for that second phase, which actually will end up being the bulk of the funding from NEVI. So we're looking at non-interstate US routes. Those are the roads in red on this map. You'll see there's dotted lines across the state. Those are scenic byways in the state. Those are locations that are priorities for tourist destinations, so local economic development. The geographies that are represented in purple on this map are the areas designated as transportation disadvantaged by the US DOT. So making sure that those communities also benefit from EV charging infrastructure and have equitable access. We're also looking at other coverage gaps such as, are there evacuation routes that aren't covered under the categories we've already laid out? Are there places that it looks like we need additional capacity where there's really high demand along our existing interstates? So that is a phase that we're just starting to work on, thinking about how do we build out, and it will be sort of an evolving phase as we learn from this first round of chargers. So speaking of the first round, we put out a notice of funding opportunity, or a NOFO, early in the spring of this year. We structured this as a grant program for reasons that if people want to talk more about, I can get into. But basically the way this works is we are offering grant funding to the private sector to build out these charging stations. And when we say the private sector, eligible applicants include charging network operators. So think ChargePoint, EVgo, companies that make and maintain charging infrastructure. It could also be a site host, so a gas station, a hotel, an organization that works with hotels and gas stations to manage their infrastructure, as well as it's not just the private sector that this is open to. We also have eligibility for nonprofits and for local government agencies if they are interested in applying for this program and for funding. The important thing was that the application needed to have the whole team identified. So where is the infrastructure going to be? Who owns that land? Who's responsible for the connection to the utilities? What is the equipment that's going to be installed on that site going to look like, and ensuring that it meets all of the requirements of the NEVI program. And importantly, this program requires that the station is operational for 5 years after it's in the ground, and it needs to be the uptime requirement is 97%. So who's going to make sure that that happens? So all those pieces are built into the grant application. As a result of the program, we selected 37 locations. You'll see there on this map, they're green dots. We've made a little over $25 million in conditional awards, and those are going to a total of 9 companies, with a number of subrecipients who fit in those categories I was just talking about in terms of maintenance and site hosts and that kind of thing. We're really excited to see this. One of the things we're excited about is that we had budgeted originally about $1 million per site. We weren't quite sure. This is the learning process for all of us, and so we weren't quite sure how much was going to be needed to build each of these sites to these requirements. And the applications came in actually a little under what we had budgeted, which gives us even more money to spend on additional infrastructure off the corridors. So next steps, it's taken a long time to get to the point of selecting these first round of awardees. And that's really just the first step. Now we have to get from selection to construction. So there's a lot of work going on here at IDOT to work with grantees, to get them through grant agreement processes, to make sure that they're following all of the federal rules for transportation infrastructure that were really designed for constructing bridges and roads, things like the environmental review process. So working through how we're going to manage all of those different pieces. We're planning on doing a second notice of funding opportunity late this year to fill in a few gaps that are remaining from that first round where we didn't get eligible applicants. And then we also have a couple of other discretionary grant programs that we are working on administering. So these are awards that we won, we competed against other states, and we are working on implementing. So I mentioned charging and fueling infrastructure, CFI, and then we are also working on the Reliability and Accessibility Accelerator Program, which is funding specifically for fixing some broken chargers. And so the last thing I wanted to put up was how can you get involved? How can you stay informed? All of the details of the program are available on IDOT's website. There's a link on this slide, but there's also, if you just search for Drive Electric, or Illinois Drive Electric, it will take you to a page with all the information, the awards, the notice of funding opportunity, an opportunity to sign up for additional, we basically send out email blasts whenever there's an announcement. That's all there. All of our recordings from the webinars we do, all of that lives on our website. So there's a wide range of information. And if you're just interested in questions, you can also email dot.driveelectric@illinois.gov, and that will also take you to connect you with the department, and we can answer your questions. So with that, I am going to stop sharing so I can see you all a little better. But I will also say I'm happy to go back to slides if people want to see those. So for now, I will stop sharing and happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I was just thinking, well, it's one of why don't gas stations jump in on this opportunity to turn some of their like gas pumps into EV chargers? Or in other words, why don't you take the burden of creating these stops and infrastructure and building and management, all that stuff off your shoulders and subcontract some of these stations to build out the infrastructure themselves or to convert some of the infrastructure themselves? And that way you have less to do. Like, is there something giant that I'm missing?
Well, so I will say gas stations they're one of the people that's the most interested in putting this infrastructure in. So in the first round, one of our biggest awardees is Love's. So they are, they're very interested. And the other thing about this grant program is that it is a public-private partnership in the sense that they still have to bring some skin to the game. So this program and most federal grant programs work as they have a match requirements. So the federal funds will provide up to 80% of the project cost, and the rest will be paid for by the private sector. So they're putting money in the game, and we're putting money in the game. And when as part of how we structured our application process and our review, we gave more points to sites that had a higher private sector cost sharing. So if you say you wanted to put in 40% of the cost, all the better. I think, again, I'll just go back to saying the goal here and the reason why the government is an important actor in this and not just the private sector, why don't we just leave it to them to do it, is that we want to make sure that this infrastructure goes everywhere. So not just in the places where there are currently cars to support that demand, but in places where people are not quite sure that they are ready for an EV because they don't see the chargers, or in places that are long distance routes where maybe there aren't a lot of people locally who have EVs, but people may want to travel through that area. And disadvantaged communities where there might not be, again, a market right now. So this federal funding is helping to bridge that gap between sort of where we see the future going, which is that these stations are going to be self-sustaining. Once they get through this 5 years, that infrastructure is on the private sector to maintain. But getting through this transition period where we're ramping up the number of vehicles on the road pretty significantly.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for being with us today. And I do appreciate giving us an overview of what's going on, especially for the Kent lecture as we are talking about electrification. It's good for our students to know about where we are in the state of Illinois. So my question, actually, I have two quick questions. The first one is, as we are trying to reduce the dependence on the coal for the electricity, and this is going really well in the state, we're going to replace that with renewable energy, of course. So where do you see us going to provide the needed electricity for the grid?
So that's a good question, and it is something that I am not at all an expert in.
Okay.
So I know there's a lot of that slide that I had up that had all those other state agencies that are working on pieces of this. The ICC being one, the Illinois Power Agent, IPA being another one of them. They're really the ones who are taking the lead on that grid cleanup and supply issue side of things. CEJA also set a lot of aggressive goals and programs related to specifically on the renewable energy side of the equation. So we are part of those conversations and trying to feed into them. But that's, I won't try to speculate because I just sort of have what I read in the newspapers in terms of where that's going to go.
Okay, so my second quick question, if I may, Laura.
Of course.
Okay. So the NEVI now, as you are submitting your proposals as the state of Illinois, are you trying to focus more on trucks, e-trucks, or because it was very clear in your presentation that regular vehicles depend less on the charging outside their homes in a way. So are you focusing more on e-trucks?
So the NEVI program is really designed, the formula part that's coming to the states is really designed for passenger vehicles first.
Right.
The requirements are really centered around sort of long distance travel and passenger vehicles. We want to, as much as possible, make sure these stations are future proofed. So in our evaluation for the first round of proposals, we gave projects extra points if they did things like design a pull-through station. So if you've got like a medium-duty truck, you're not trying to like back into a space, you can pull through in the way that you do in a gas station now. So there's things like that. There's things like higher power levels that will probably be needed for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. So that's the piece as part of specifically NEVI that we're focusing on, or that has some provisions for medium and heavy duty vehicles. I will say we're doing a lot of other work and we're working closely with the Illinois EPA on some other programs specifically around freight. And in part that's because when we talked to industry, one of the things they said was, if you're a truck driver and you're doing a long distance route, are you going to want to risk pulling into a station where there's a bunch of other passenger vehicles parked and you're waiting behind someone? They tend to want charging infrastructure that it's really dedicated for medium and heavy duty vehicles. So that's the charging and fueling infrastructure program. There's a piece of that program that's really focused on the freight side, and we've been working with IEPA. They put out a call for partners earlier this year. They submitted an application for this next round of funding that's really focused on the medium and heavy duty side of things. We're also working with that, I mentioned the Carbon Pollution Reduction Grant, CPRG. There's a piece of that funding that's going to some concierge service for medium and heavy duty vehicles and helping think through like what are the barriers around conversion there. So, and helping kind of overcome them. So there's a lot of work going on, but it's not specific to NEVI. I see a question in the chat. Can you comment on any opportunities for data collection and sharing on the use of NEVI and IRA funded supported chargers? Are charging providers expected to share data? Yes, they are expected to share data. And I will say that's a big piece of our next steps here are how are we, so getting from award to construction and then from construction to monitoring and performance evaluation. And I mentioned there's a big chunk of this funding that we haven't already spent. So we want to be learning all the lessons we can from this first round to make us more efficient in spending the rest of our funding. So program evaluation is a big piece that we're starting to work on. There's a lot of data. The site owners, the recipients of funding, are required to submit data to us and to the feds, particularly around reliability and uptime. So that's going to be a big piece. And that reporting process is something that the feds are still kind of working through exactly what that's going to look like. I will say it's been really interesting and fun, but sometimes a little stressful, in that this program is something that DOTs aren't used to doing, and the federal government isn't necessarily used to doing. And so as we've been working to set up this program, the rules are kind of being written and the best practices are being written while we're trying to implement. So we're all trying to be flexible and trying to learn as we go. And data is a really important piece of that. But we're also trying to make sure that we don't require so much data that it slows down getting projects out the door.
I have one more question.
Yeah, thank you for the nice presentation. I have two questions. The first question is that you mentioned that Illinois has set a goal of having 1 million EVs by 2030. Is there any goal of having electric trucks penetration by 2030 or 2035? Because we know of states that who hasn't. And my second question is that, are there any plans of deploying megawatt charging systems or the super fast chargers like Tesla have or NREL is developing, and what's IDOT's plan on that?
Yeah, so I will say, as far as a goal related to medium and heavy duty, there's not something codified in law. I think the sense has been that it'll be a little slower for the medium and heavy duty industry to adopt low carbon vehicles, and just because the technology is a little more challenging, the fleet turnover is a little slower. So that's something that we're really turning our attention to now. The last few years have been really focused on how do we make sure we get the passenger fleet up off the ground. So we don't have a particular goal on the medium and heavy duty side, but it's an area of increasing focus and interest. And then can you repeat your second question again?
And the second question was on the plan on deploying super fast chargers that NREL or Tesla are working on, which would probably reduce the time of charging heavy duty electric trucks to probably 30 minutes, which is more practical.
Yeah, I think that is a piece of future proofing. We're not requiring it for NEVI, but we did sort of ask applicants what are their plans for future in terms of capacity for higher power levels. That's the challenge there, and one of the things that we've been learning a lot about is coordinating with utilities, because as you start thinking about megawatt sites, you start getting into pretty significant power demands, particularly when you're, I mean, anywhere in the state, but especially in some of the rural areas of the state. The available power is a key piece of this equation. And so in future rounds, we may see a need to, on these sites, we have the ability to fund things like on-site, either battery storage, renewable energy generation, those kinds of things. So that's another piece of the equation here. I see a question in the chat. Notice most of the corridors that we're starting this first round are the federal, the interstate highways, efforts to bring EV charging stations in part of the states that aren't traversed by the interstates. So yes, this program, the NEVI program, it requires us to focus on these alternative fuel corridors first, and we have to build out those corridors before we can spend money elsewhere. So it is a high priority for us to get through this first round and get those stations in the ground as quickly as possible so that we can shift to our more flexible funding in other places around the state. And one of the reasons, I mean, sometimes people are like, well, why don't you just designate more roads as our alternative fuel corridors? Some states chose that strategy. Florida in particular designated like all of their roads as AFCs. The challenge with that is it's not only location requirements, but there are different power level requirements if you're on a corridor, an AFC, versus off a corridor. So you can do off corridors, you can do a mix of level 2s and DCFCs, which may be more appropriate either for demand or for electricity capacity at a site. So we're really pushing as hard as we can to meet that fully built out definition, so that we can start spending on the rest of the state. I had another thought and it just left my brain. So if it comes back to me, I'll let you know.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you said that there's a goal of 46 additional stations that meet the 50-mile rule or something. When do you expect these to be done?
Was that when?
When do you expect that the 46 stations are going to be like functional and stuff?
Yeah. So the 37 that we just awarded, the next steps are they need to sign a grant agreement with the department, and hopefully that will be a smooth process, but you know, there may be some back and forth. Our hope is to get most, if not all, those stations under construction next year. The other thing that's a sort of unknown factor is utility timelines. So there's a lot of activity going on and there's a lot of demand for transformers. So depending on what electric capacity the site already has, there may be a delay in getting those sites energized. And that was one of the priorities when we were looking at applications and reviewing potential sites, was which ones can get online the fastest. So hopefully next year, or into early 2026 for full build out. Is there any funding for EV chargers for apartment and condo building garages? I don't know about the funding question. That may be a local, well, I'll say two things. Both a local ordinance or local government question, as well as there are utility programs, they're called beneficial electrification programs, that provide funding for charging installation. So I would check your utility as another source of funding. The Illinois EPA funding includes level 2 funding. Chicago also just won a charging and fueling infrastructure community grant program. So they will have grant funding to spend on charging that will be a mix of level 2 and DCFC funding. So yes, there are definitely funding sources out there. The department is not focused on the sort of apartment condo building piece of this work. The next question was about how is IDOT working with neighboring states to align our near-term investments in electrification planning? So fleets, for example, that obviously go across multiple states, and heavy-duty EVs need to make sure that they can make those journeys. Yeah, so we have a consortium of states in the Midwest that is it's called Rev Midwest, which is specifically focused on medium and heavy duty vehicles and planning for medium and heavy duty vehicles. There's another coalition of states around the Great Lakes. It's the Michigan Circuit, which is, that one is more focused on passenger vehicles and tourism around Lake Michigan, and making sure that drivers can travel all the way around the lake. So that's another multi-state effort. There's also just a lot of conversations and learning back and forth between the states. I mentioned that we're all learning as we go, and every state is approaching the NEVI program a little bit differently. So we are regularly in touch with other states to talk about, well, how did you structure this? Can we work together on a grant application for funding for medium and heavy duty? I'm headed to a conference next week where we're all gonna compare notes again. So it's been really helpful. There's a handful of people in each state who are all at various points tearing our hair out or celebrating as we make progress on this.
If there's time. Yeah, thanks for the presentation and answering so many questions. I think there's a lot to learn here for us. I think on the subject of the residential charging, there was a recent law passed that requires every residential unit, if it has parking available, has to be equipped to handle EV charging at some point. And I wonder, I guess, first of all, to make sure that's correct, and second of all, I wonder, could that be leveraged by IDOT? I mean, I'm envisioning maybe some places that are close to an interstate where people might want to stop, that, hey, this apartment building doesn't have many EV drivers, but has all these spaces thanks to the new law. Could it be something that IDOT leverages as part of the larger charging network?
Yeah, I think there's definitely potential there. Again, I'm not an expert. My sense is most apartment buildings are generally putting in level 2 charging because of the general patterns. People will park there for longer distances or longer time, right? So it may not work for the DC fast charging, but it's certainly an opportunity. And that's part of why we kept our eligibility pretty flexible. The requirements for the feds is it has to be open to the general public, and it has to be open for the corridors. It has to be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that's the other thing is, making sure that the site host is comfortable with people who don't necessarily live there, using that infrastructure at any time. And it usually can't be, like if someone from who lives there is parked someplace, parked in a site overnight, like, does that count as available?
Yeah.
Maybe not. So I think there is a lot of room for creativity and flexibility here. So definitely keep the ideas coming, because we're all learning how this is going to go, and how the industry is evolving constantly. In terms of who the big manufacturers are, and what data they're providing, and all that sort of things. The one other thing that I was going to mention, and I forgot to include it in my presentation, so I'm going to take advantage of just a second to talk about it, is one thing that if you're in a space that's really focused on EVs, a conversation that sometimes gets lost in translation from the conversations that we're in with people who are focused on transportation infrastructure more broadly, is every EV that's on the road is less gas that is purchased. And that's great from a climate perspective, but as folks may know, the gas tax is the way that we fund most of our transportation infrastructure in the country. And so there is a long-term question to answer here around how do we make sure that as we get more and more EVs on the road, we're also making sure that the roads that those EVs drive on continue to be able to be maintained, and our roads and bridges continue to have a good condition, because even with the huge amounts of funding that are available through IIJA, we're kind of keeping track, keeping on pace in terms of maintaining our infrastructure. And there's so much more that we could be doing, and investing in, bike ped infrastructure and transit. So there's a lot of needs on transportation outside of EVs. So that's a long-term funding question that still needs to be wrestled with.
Professor Al-Qadi has a last.
That was last question, right? Okay, 1 minute. Elizabeth, one of my colleagues here who specialized in charges, Phil Crane, he was suggesting that the best way to go about this is to change all the parking meters to charging, and start charging both at the same time. While you are charging your car, you're parking your car, and have this. Have anybody discussed this with you as an idea?
Yeah, I've heard about it. I know, in urban areas, this is, I think, something people are really interested in. In general, IDOT is not managing parking in the state,
Yep.
or meters, that sort of thing. So that's the kind of thing where we can, some through our research dollars, helping municipalities think through some of these things. It probably won't be something that IDOT ourselves is building. But yeah, that's the kind of innovation in the space that I think we're gonna come through the next few years. I've seen a lot about sort of like light poles with integrated charging in them.
Yes.
Sorry, I want to follow up on that question because this discussion has been ongoing on campus. If we were to do a sort of experiment on campus, for example, to convert some of the parking spaces into fully charging level 2, would there be opportunities to pursue funding from IDOT, or maybe you mentioned a few other sources? Would that be a possibility?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, we should definitely talk more. The funding sources that come to mind immediately are some of the research funding that IDOT does, and the planning funds that we have. So, you know, feasibility study kinds of things. There's also the carbon reduction strategy funds, which is another program that funds a wide range of activities, including EV charging infrastructure. In general, we've been trying to prioritize carbon reduction fundings for things that aren't as well funded under programs like NEVI, but there's always an opportunity there.
Well, thank you very much.